Dear all, thank you for watching us tonight. We are very pleased in this show to have a very precious guest that he comes from Israel, and he's an academician that, though he's an Israeli, he's very interested in Iran, and he's an author of 5 books, academic books. He's been consultant of INDF and the Prime Minister office. And actually, he has very genuine ideas, and that we are very pleased to have him. But also to spend a time to explain us about the foreign policy of Iran, to discuss the relations with Israel, and to analyze this kind of pretty much conflict also from the very religious part. So with us is Mr. Ori Goldberg, directly from Israel. Ori, it's a pleasure to have you
It's a
with
pleasure
us.
to be here, Paulina. Thank you.
It's actually been very nice because I'm following your academic work for some years now, and I believe that you are one of the people that their ideas also are included in my PhD for a reason.
Oh,
I
thank
found
you.
them very interesting, and apart from being very interested, they've been very brave as well. So, Ori, you come from you are a Jewish. You come from Israel. What did make you to be busy with Israel, with Iran?
Um, in Israel, we have a very complex national discussion with our religious identity. Because, on the one hand, Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, and on the other hand, Israel invented a kind of Judaism that never existed, state Judaism. Okay, some of it is secular, some of it is national. This is nothing like the religious rabbinic Judaism that was the mainstay of Jewish history for the last 2,000 years. So we don't like to talk a lot about our religious identity. We just assume that Israeli identity, Israeli Jewish identity, is the default option. And when I got to university, I had a chance to take a class on Iran. And I started reading on Iran, and I realized that the Iranians were having exactly the same discussion as the Israelis. What part does religious identity play alongside national identity? But the Iranians were conducting this discussion in a much more frank way, a much more open way. They were actually willing to talk about it. So the first reason that drove me to study about Iran was that I felt that as an Israeli, I was getting possibilities to discover myself that I had never gotten from Israeli schools or Israeli universities.
So do you
Then,
say that? So do you say that Iranians they discuss more open and more publicly about their religious identity than the Israelis?
they do. They're very concerned about religion, about religious identity. The Islamic Republic sees itself as a kind of a speaker for religious communities in a world that is not very religious. So they have a lot of public conferences and write a lot of articles and columns. The discussion is a profound one. In Israel, we really try to deny it because if we start talking about our Jewishness, we will need to start talking about our democracy too. And there is a tension between religion and democracy, between preferring one religious group over others and maintaining a democratic state. And right now in Israel, we like to downplay that tension. We don't like to talk about it.
So Ori, the point is that the Iranians they come and they say we are Shias. We
Hmm.
created the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is the vehicle for Ummah, for the Islamic State. But from
Yeah.
the other side, we see that there is a Jewish state that is Israel, that in order, for example, the right of return exists for the Jewish and solely for the Jewish. But from the
Yeah.
other side, you come and you say that we are Israeli, we are Israel, we are a Jewish state. From the other side, we want to be real liberal and we are a democracy. So you actually live in the both boats and you try to be liberals, but also to keep their identity as a Jewish state. And this is the conflicting
Yeah. That's
part.
very, it's our defining conflict. What are we? Israel defines itself officially as Jewish and democratic. But there is a real problem with democracy on two counts. First, if you prefer actively one religious group over all others that live in the country, you have an issue with your democracy. The second is Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. For nearly 55 years, Israel has had at its heart what is basically the opposite of a democracy. a military occupation where nothing is democratic, it's very hard to maintain a democracy in one part and a non-democracy in the other. There's a real tension there, and that tension is a foundational dimension of Israeli society. We
Or
are,
do
yeah,
other
go ahead.
people, I mean, do Israelis accept this kind of term that you give about occupation of Palestinian territories?
Well, the political debate in Israel has not really changed over the last 55 years. There are those who say it's not enough. The ones who support the status quo, you can divide them into two. There are those who are religiously motivated and say this isn't an occupation. This is our land. We took back what was ours. We need to claim it and settle it and do whatever it takes. And there are those who say we have to do it. It's a security matter. Why is it a security matter? Because if we let the Palestinians live freely, then they will create a state that will be focused almost exclusively on destroying Israel. So you've got a lot of people who hold either one of those two views. You also have a lot of Israelis who feel that the occupation is pointless, that it's not good for Israel, and they certainly support a two-state solution. Very few Israelis support what's called a one-state solution. But the people who support a two-state solution are very wary. They're very careful. They don't want to take risks. They don't want to concede something to the Palestinians for fear of what the Palestinians might do about it. So I think most Israelis, even those who would support my framing, would be very reluctant to support any sort of active moves towards achieving some kind of solution to this conflict. Israelis are very tired, they're very much afraid, and when you're tired and afraid, you don't like change. So even the situation as it is now, and it's pretty bad, is preferable to an existential change.
Ori, I mean, is it possible to be an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli in Israel and have Palestinian friends?
Yes, Palestinian friends. Yes, it's the life is difficult for the Palestinian friends. Okay, security authorities might also put you on the list if you're a Jewish Israeli who has Palestinian friends, but you can certainly have Palestinian friends. Nobody tries to stop you from doing that. Also, you have to be clear on what sort of Palestinians you're talking about, because you've got Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and identify politically as Palestinians, and you've got Palestinians who live in the territories. That's more difficult because Palestinians who live in the territories don't have free access to Israel. If you're a Jewish Israeli and you want to have Palestinian friends who live in the territories, you need to find them. And in order to do that, you have to go through a lot of military and security authorities. That's not easy. You have to be a committed political activist to do that.
Ori, I've been in both countries. I've been both in Israel, I've been both in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that in Israel, I had the idea that, I am in a militaristic state. I could see the army everywhere. I could see armed soldiers, even in non-uniforms, but still being armed. From the other side, I used to be in Iran, and in Iran, I couldn't see anyone armed. What I used to see here and there, it was, only the traffic police.
Uh-huh.
So I could feel, let's say, in a way more free in Iran, but of course I could see that they were watching me. I could see how I was
Yeah.
having the access on Facebook. They were not there, but of course I could see that there was a kind of monitoring. At that time, I was a very good tourist, so none said anyone to me anything about Iran. And from Iran, and from the other side, I was in Israel, and I could feel, the pressure of security. What is the difference between Iran and Israel when it comes to security matters?
Well, the truth is, well, again, it depends on who you ask. For Jews, let's answer the question for Jews. For Jews, Israel is a democracy. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Certainly, our security organizations have a lot of leeway and a lot of possibilities in maintaining public order and so on and so forth. But it's still a democracy. Jewish citizens have rights. They can demand that these security organizations explain why and how they follow them. They do have a lot of power, security organizations, but not excessive power. For Palestinians, the situation is very different. Our security organizations monitor them very closely, both Israeli citizens and non-citizens, and their lives are much, much more difficult. There's a lot more involvement on the part of security organizations. Iran is not a democracy. Iran is a totalitarian or authoritarian dictatorship. Okay? Iran doesn't even have a pretense of a democracy. Iran's security organizations have pretty much unlimited capabilities and authority given by the government to monitor anything that is perceived as a threat, not just to Iran, but to the Islamic regime. And the thing about dictatorships is that when they work, they're very, very effective. What you described sounds very sensible. A dictatorship that works is a dictatorship that doesn't need to beat up people in the streets. It's a dictatorship where everybody knows to police themselves. Everybody knows to watch what they say. Everybody knows where the limits are. If you are somebody who comes from outside, sometimes those limits will seem arbitrary or strange. But if you live in a dictatorship and you've internalized the way the dictatorship operates, you don't need to be actively threatened repeatedly. You know your boundaries. You know how far you can go. So I would say
But
that's the
still,
difference.
only, for example, I was in Iran and I could go to a synagogue, I could go to the mosque and to the church freely. No
Sure.
one was saying to me, do something else. For example, we see in Christmas that the Ayatollah is visiting the Armenians for the
Hmm.
Christmas.
Yeah.
From the other side, we see that, for example, I can go free to synagogue. There is a Jewish minority there, a community, I would say. I wouldn't say it's a minority, a community. So they perform their duties as well. They don't beat up people in the street, but when it comes to Israel, they do beat up people in the streets.
Well, I mean, again, you're right. And by the way, what you just said about Christians and Jews is, I think, a good illustration of the position that the Islamic Republic takes with regard to religion. They are pro-religion. They want religious minorities to practice their religions freely. But see, again, it's a difference between an effective dictatorship in a country that's still not a dictatorship. In Iran, you don't need to beat people in the street. Everybody knows where you. Everybody knows how far you can go. Everybody knows where you have to stop in terms of speech, in terms of action, in terms of demonstration against the government. Israel, because it is a democracy, certainly for Jews, the public situation here is very volatile. Okay, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of potential
But
violence.
or is what you say. It's a democracy for Jews. In Iran, it's a democracy for Iranians, whatever they are. They can be
No,
Jews. They can be
it's
whatever.
not. It's not a democracy. Iran is not a democracy. Iran is an authoritarian country at best, and could be also defined as a dictatorship. It's just that there is no single dictator. The Islamic regime, as it's called, holds the country very powerfully. Iranian civil rights exist in a very limited way. Iranian elections are at best half democratic. Iran is not a democracy for Iranians. Iran is an authoritarian country, like Arab countries are. Okay? It's not much different from a place like Egypt, where there's a ruler who holds the country with an iron fist. As long as you do what you're told and you don't actively threaten public order and you don't actively criticize the ruler, you can live your life. But Iranians know very well that um, if they go too far in expressing dissent, if they go too far in resisting government endeavors, if they try to offer a political model for Iran that doesn't include the Islamic Republic, they will be taken away, most often without trial, and put in jail for a very long time. That doesn't happen to Jews in Israel. It can potentially happen to non Jews. And it's complicated. Israeli democracy for Jews is a pretty robust one, even though it's kind of faltering over the last few years. But as far as democracy for non-Jews goes, it's in very bad shape. It's in very bad shape. Just recently, we had last yesterday or 2 days ago, our Minister of Defense declared 6 organizations that operate in the territories that are well known to be some of the most um, effective and well established human rights organizations in the territories. Our Minister of Defense declared them to be terrorist organizations or organizations that assist terrorism, basically outlawed them. There's a huge uproar in Israel. Okay, I mean, a lot of people will say, sure, why not? They're all terrorists. But a lot of people are standing up and saying, this is wrong. The Minister of Defense is already taking political repercussions. The Americans are upset. This thing couldn't happen in Iran. If Iran wanted to outlaw an organization, it would outlaw it immediately and it would be declared a terrorist organization in an hour. That's not the case in Israel.
Ori, what do, you know? I've been watching a lot, Mr. Yossi Cohen. Actually, he was one of my lovely persons because Netanyahu was one of the prime ministers I was very interested in. So Yossi Cohen provided Netanyahu with a lot of plans, with a lot of photos from nuclear plants in Tehran. He was giving to him, addresses that he was using the speeches in the UN. So he was pushing very much on Netanyahu, saying that Iran is going to obtain a nuclear bomb or something. Recently, he gave an interview, and I saw it in Jerusalem Post, saying that Iran is not even close to nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
So do you see that there is a kind of betrayal, I mean, by the security authorities of Israel to the Jewish, that they come and they say to Jews, just feel this kind of threat. Iran is treating us, is getting a nuclear bomb. They're hunting after us. But at the end of the day, after he finished his service and now he is free to become a public figure, he comes out and says that, guys, I mean, Iran is far away from a nuclear bomb.
That's a very good question, and any attempt to answer it will have to be in several parts. Okay, first to start with Yossi Cohen's speech. You're giving him way too much credit. He didn't change his mind. What he wanted to say in the speech was, because I served as head of Mossad for several years, I made sure that Iran would not be even close to a nuclear bomb. Okay, he was singing his own. He was singing his own praises. That was the whole point he was trying to make. But the deeper question is about. And here, public opinion in Israel is, I don't want to say it's divided. There's an Israeli consensus and there is some opposition to which I belong. The Israeli consensus is that Iran has nothing more important it wants to accomplish than obtaining a nuclear bomb and either threatening Israel with it, but most Israelis believe Iran wants to destroy Israel with it. Okay? Most Israelis believe, and this includes people like Yossi Cohen, most Israelis believe that Iran wants to obtain a nuclear bomb and destroy Israel with it. This is what we hear from, what we heard from our seemingly eternal Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, for more than a decade. He kept saying exactly that. Basically, what he was saying was, the year is 1938. Iranian leaders are the new Nazis. If we don't stop them, they will destroy Israel because Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, right? They want to kill Jews. Most people that I know who work for the defense establishment, for the military, for Mossad, for the government in various capacities, don't think that's the case. Okay? Most of them don't think Iran is an existential threat. And most of them, again, some of them are in a dilemma because if they accept the premise that Iran is an existential threat, they will get a lot of money. Okay, the Israeli Air Force has had its budget increased by billions of shekels because it needs to prepare for a potential strike on Iran. Okay? But despite that fact, most of our prominent generals don't believe that the Iranian threat is an existential threat to Israel.
What is Iran for Israel?
Wow, very good question. We used to be it used to be our best friend before, up
Well,
until
yeah,
1979.
I think until 1977, actually, when Likud came to power and this
No,
changed.
even until 79, when the Shah fled, it used to be our best friend, and because there are a lot of resemblances, a lot of similarities between Jews and Shia Muslims.
What are the
And
similarities actually? Because We discussed that privately. So you promise you are going to explain in this show what is the similarity between the Shia Islam and the Judaism.
Okay.
From my perspective, I study very much Shia. I had Quran lessons and everything.
Hmm.
Of course, it was a pleasure because as Shia Islam is very close to
Hmm.
Orthodox Church.
Hmm.
Byzantium and Persian Empire they met in the past, and actually Mahdi, the Messiah that is coming with Jews, is half Greek. His mother, Narges, she was a Greek Orthodox of her times. So
Hmm.
from every perspective, we are very proud to see that the Messiah of the Shias is half Greek. But
Okay.
how Judaism is close to Shiism?
Well, we don't have such close family relations, but we have very close relations in principle. Judaism, like Shia Islam, is a small minority religion, often persecuted by the larger majority religions. And like the Jews, the Shia certainly, well, they've had political power for 500 years now, but Shia tradition is one of persecution, is one of shying away from political power. Well, there have been Shia kings in Iran, the Shia religious establishment, right up until the Islamic Revolution in 79, rejected the notion that there could be a Shia ruler that would have religious legitimacy. Okay, the Shia are waiting for the Imam. He is the just ruler, the Imam who will return as Messiah. He is the just ruler, and this historical tradition created a situation where Shia, like Jews, invest most of their efforts in the study of texts. Their religious memory is not linked to political institutions, but to sacred texts and their rational study. So the entire intellectual culture of Shiism is very much like Judaism. And another dimension that is very popular is the Messianic dimension. The notion that there's always tension between reality on the ground and future reality, which will be ideal, which will be a reality of redemption, where a redeemer will come, and that redeemer will also be a political redeemer. In that sense, maybe there is a very close kinship between Shiism and Judaism. It's not just about um, saving humanity. It's not just about dying on the cross to redeem the sins of all humans. It's about being a chosen people, suffering for centuries and centuries and centuries while you wait for the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, the chosen people will be restored to its proper place. That's true
Yeah,
for
but
Shia as it is
that
for Jews.
this kind of exceptionalism exists from the part of Jewish, I would say, and we see that the Jewish people they didn't meet the Messiah, so the Messiah will come. But from the other side, the Shia they have seen already Mahdi. Mahdi left; he's gonna return, but there is a very close political. I mean the political Islamic Shiism exists much more than in any other part of Islam because we see that Islam is being interpreted according to the wisdom and the traditions of the Persian Empire, and they accepted Islam and they prepared Shias, and of course the wife of third Imam Hussein, she's a Persian lady, Shabhanu. So this is the kinship and by blood that belongs to the Persian Empire. But in any case, what we see in Shias is that the Messiah, Mahdi, that is coming in order to create Ummah. So there is an existing political system that Shia Islam it wants. From the other side, Judaism, most of the people they used to live in communities, so they
Mhm.
never came up say that we want to create the Jewish Ummah, let's say, or a state for
Well,
Jewish.
you're right, but actually, I think you're only demonstrating my point. The Shia political community, as you're talking about it, is something that belongs to the far past. And remember that the Mahdi he went into occlusion. He was taken by God as a boy. He was never a king, and even when he was a 12th descendant in a dynasty that began with. He was the 11th descendant of a dynasty that began with Imam Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. And that was all there was as far as the Shia polity was concerned. And already the sixth Imam basically said that Shia Imams do not seek active political power. So the notion of the Shia polity is from the mythical past. And that is exactly the case for the Israeli state. When the Israeli state was established, our founding father, David Ben Gurion, he made a conscious decision to establish Israel as a direct continuation of the ancient biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judea. He wanted to sever the link between the new state and the communities that you mentioned that characterize Jewish life. Why? Because he had to have something that would allow him to take all the Jews that were pouring into the new country from Europe, from North Africa, from other Arabic speaking countries, and make them cohere into a single political entity. So just like the Shia, he went back to the far past. Okay? And he said, We are we are links in a chain that began with the biblical kings. So as far as the tension between present and mythical history goes, Judaism and Shia are as close as they can be. Okay? Add to that the dimension of messianism, where it always hovers over current politics. What will happen? Okay, what sort of redemption are we going to experience? And the proximity, at least the way I see it, is almost uncanny.
Ori, let's start from 79.
Okay.
What was strange about Israel is they had Likud in 77. Likud, it was much more rational towards religion, let's say. So in
Mm-hmm.
79, we see that Shah is leaving in January, 16th of January, 1st of February. Imam Khomeini is coming to Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 22 September 1980, we have the Iran-Iraq war. How important is this date for Israel? What changed? Why Imam Khomeini didn't want to have any kind of relations with Israel?
Well, I think mostly for domestic Iranian reasons. You have to remember that Khomeini was the leader of a very vocal opposition to the Shah, but as far as the religious establishment goes, he was a minority. Okay, most of the Ayatollahs who lived in Iran supported the Shah. When Khomeini returned to Iran, he arrested 3 or 4 of his main rivals because they supported the Shah. But generally speaking, one of the Shah's most controversial policies, or perhaps his most controversial policy direction, was to ally Iran with the West. He wanted Iran to be a part of the Western family of nations. Remember, this is a Cold War world. Okay, and he knew that in order to do that, in order to get Washington to be on his side, Iranians were always afraid of Russia long before it became the Soviet Union. So he knew that in order to get Washington to be on his side, he needs to have a very close alliance with Israel. But it wasn't just for instrumental reasons. The Shah looked at Israel and saw a country that was very similar to his own. Okay, it was stuck in a hostile ocean of Arabs. Iranians don't like Arabs; they don't work well. Right? And Israel didn't like Arabs, so there was a mutual alliance there. And also, the Shah saw Israel as a country that was just like Iran. It was trying to transcend its geography. Israel never saw itself as part of the Middle East. Israel always considered itself a part of Europe. It was just an accident that we were geographically located in Asia. The Shah wanted something very similar for Iran. He wanted it to be very clear that Iran was an advanced country, a developed country. So Khomeini, who was leading the main opposition to the Shah, basically wanted to do the opposite of everything the Shah did. I don't think Khomeini's view on Israel was necessarily doctrinally radical. But just like Trump after Obama, Khomeini's agenda was to undo everything that the Shah did. And the alliance with Israel was a very important part of the Shah's policy.
How
So,
how today is Khomeini presented in the Israel history and in the politics?
pretty much as he always was, as a kind of boogeyman. the kind of a monster that rose from the id of political Islam, kind of a dark, bearded presence, a fanatic, somebody who only wanted, the destruction of the enemies of Islam.
You are a consultant at the Prime Minister office. Do you recycle this kind of ideas, or you go there and you explain them about the personality of Khomeini?
Oh, I'm considered a crazy consultant. Okay,
Which means,
they, which means that of course I go and tell them what I think. I think my opinions. I wrote several book chapters and books about Khomeini. I'm fascinated by his personality, and my explanation of his personality is really not at all as a black demon. So of course I explain to my defense colleagues my opinions. They don't always agree, or they rarely agree, but they like to listen because they find me interesting.
so what do
Uh,
you believe about his personality?
oh, I think he was a pragmatist.
He-
I think he was more than anything. I mean, I think he had political opinions that were constructed in within the anti-imperialism discourse of the 50s and 60s, but I don't think he was much of a politician. I think he genuinely saw himself as a public leader, as somebody who stepped up when his country and his religious community needed him. And I think there was a period of time, certainly the first years of the Islamic Republic, where he was, as the Americans say, high on his own stash. He was intoxicated by the war and the rhetoric and the mobilized reality. But I think that at heart, he was a pragmatist. I think he wanted stability for Iran. I think he was radical in his own way because he invented, or not invented, he took a political idea that was very marginal in Shiism, the notion of what's called the velayat faqih, the ruling cleric, right? Entrusting the politics of the country to the clerics. And he made it an ideology. But this was a fairly late development. Khomeini became a revolutionary when he was 62 years old. Before then, he was a part of the clerical establishment, and I think that at heart, he was a pragmatic old man.
I took an interview by Marvin Zonis. He
Mm-hmm.
passed away in November
Mm-hmm.
2020. I think it was his last interview before he passed away. So he was in the White Revolution 63. In June, it was after the speech of Khomeini in Qom. He
Mm-hmm.
arrived in Iran, and actually he met Khomeini a few weeks before Khomeini in 79 comes to Iran. So when I asked him about his personality, he said to me that Khomeini, he doesn't, I mean, personally, he doesn't believe in the magic of people, but he said what he saw in Khomeini, it was something exceptional. He
Mm-hmm.
said that Khomeini, he was something magic. He was the man that certainly Iranians, they were waiting for. So when
Mm-hmm.
I asked him, because he's been a lot of time, a long time, 14 years in exile, Khomeini. I asked him about his time especially in Iraq, and Marvis discussed with Khomeini about the preparation that he was doing in Iraq about the creation of Al-Dawa. So apart from pragmatism, certainly he was a very strategic mind because he
Yes.
knew in order, of course, to let the Shah outside, he didn't also need to have the power inside Iran, but he wanted a kind of having a very friendly environment next to him. That's why he was very close to the Shia in northern Iraq. He was very close to Alevite. That in 82 they became part of Shia after
Mm-hmm.
the declaration. So when you compare him to today's Ayatollah Khamenei, how do you see the way that they manage to govern the country and also their mission? What do you see? Is there any difference in the missions between Khomeini and Khamenei?
First, yes, obviously, but I mean, remember, Khomeini was the one who had to make it all happen. He led
Yes,
the Islamic Republic for 10 years, a little less, and most of those years were war years. Right?
with
And
Iraq, yes.
yeah, he oversaw a war-torn country, and he had to make sure the Islamic regime established its existence, but everything was life or death for Khomeini during his time as leader. And before that, Khomeini was definitely a strategist, but he was a strategist working from the opposition. Khamenei is a very different man. Uh, he is much less impressive, I understand. Remember, Khomeini was a senior Ayatollah. Okay? He was one of the senior Ayatollahs in Iran. He had a very massive religious and literary education. He was a stern man, he was an orthodox conservative man, but he was very broad minded. And as you say, he was very strategic. Khamenei had a very different mission. Khamenei needed to take the Islamic Republic and rebuild it after the war with Iraq, which he did, by the way, uh, fairly successfully. And he had to expand the Islamic regime. He had to um, take the Islamic regime to the next stage where it was concerned not just with the very act of survival, but with a potential legacy, with a vision for the country, with an idea of where Iran would be 10 or 20 or 30 years into the future. Khamenei is not the strategist that Khomeini was, but he is a coalition builder. Right? He is a mediator. He's also a very pragmatic old man. He also has, of course, his corrupt sides, right? It's very clear from independent investigations that he has appropriated dozens, if not hundreds of millions from state money and has lined his own family's, personal economic future. But that's okay. All leaders in the Middle East do that. Khamenei is a smart man. He's a capable man. I think he is very much committed to making sure that the Islamic regime continues to lead Iran. And he is, again, at heart, a coalition builder. He does very little on his own. One of the things you
Ori,
hear. Yeah, go ahead.
what was the issue with Israel? We discussed about Khomeini, we discussed about Khamenei, but coming to the recent developments between Iran and Israel, and I'm starting about the recent ones from 2019. What was the issue? Why it was so important for Israel, the assassination of Soleimani?
Oh, I don't think the assassination of Soleimani was actually that important for Israel, but it was in some way. I think the thing about Soleimani was apparently a remarkably capable field commander. Soleimani was the personal presence that organized Iran's activities in the field all over the Middle East, from Lebanon to Yemen to North Africa. And he rose to prominence, and he was really very talented. He was very good at his job. And when he died, the Revolutionary Guards lost probably the most powerful political presence they had ever had. Right? He held in his head the entire Iranian operation outside of Iran. And when he died, that was a severe blow to the Revolutionary Guard. It was a severe blow to the regime as well, because he was very, very popular. On a personal basis, he was seen as the honest, trustworthy soldier, as a man who truly devoted his life to the welfare of Iran and Iranians. Yeah.
And what about the new one, Ismail Ghani?
No, he's an apparatchik. Nobody sees him as a figure remotely close to Soleimani in the sense of authority. Soleimani was considered a kingmaker. If an Iranian politician had a photo op with Soleimani, that spoke a lot for that person's credibility. It drove his popularity ratings up. Khani,
I tell you something. I tell you something. I come from the strategy and investment sector. So I studied Iranian foreign policy and investments. I tell you what, Soleimani was something really remarkable. Probably none is gonna be like Soleimani very soon.
I agree.
He was a kind of diplomatic and military weapon and a great strategy man. From the other side, I believe that his assassination was totally a big mistake, and it's one of the big mistakes that United States and later Israel they've done together, as Israel more or less admitted that was working on this operation with the United States. The
Hmm.
problem is that Soleimani, he was this kind of person that he was taking all the operations, as we explained very well. So when Soleimani was operating, the people from Dawa were listening to him. Hezbollah was listening to him. Probably Hamas was listening to him. So he had, let's say, the upper hand. After his assassination, Iran is having a kind of, Iran is working like a machine, which means that someone is dying, we have the next one that is going to replace him. And actually, Ghani replaced Soleimani in 24 hours. But what
Hmm.
Iran is doing after Soleimani passed away, he found a very cost-effective way to replace him. At the beginning, it was Soleimani with part of his army and the guardians that they were going outside the borders of Iran. So that was expensive for Iran. And from the time of life cost and from the other side of expenses. Now, what is doing with Ghani is Ghani is supervising from Afghanistan to Beirut. They keep him
Hmm.
home and they come and they say to Nasrallah, listen, now we're working together, but you are the upper hand in Hezbollah and in Lebanon. So actually, we work together. Probably we tell you what to do, and you do it on your own stuff with Hezbollah. They say the same thing with Houthi. Probably they say the same thing with Hamas and what's going on in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So from this part, we see that Iran is doing the same job, but in a more cost-effective way. So now
I agree. I agree. I
so
agree.
now we see that the assassination of Soleimani make Hezbollah, Hamas, and all the other groups more powerful than they used to be the time of Soleimani. That's why we see when the Iranian foreign minister, he was a couple of weeks in Beirut, and he didn't agree about the port with General Aoun. Immediately we had electricity blackout for 1 2 days, and then the pro-Iranian groups, they were arms in the center of Beirut. So what they say in this case is that Iran probably is behind in the larger image of the foreign policy, but from the other side, those groups that are more autonomous and they can be more dangerous to Israel.
I agree very much. But you are touching on what I think is in Israeli discourse the ultimate question about Iran. Man, the ultimate question about Iran is what does Iran want? And I think most Israelis, in one way or another, believe that if you leave Iran alone, what Iran wants is the most extreme option that there is. Either the destruction of Israel or the domination of the Middle East. You can argue which one, but that Iranians are extremists and that they are irrational at heart, that they are committed to their ideology and that that ideology is extreme and radical. And in the name of that ideology, they will not make rational decisions.
Is it
Okay?
ideology or a strategic pragmatism that you are
That's
a
exactly
problem? You are
that's
a problem
exactly
for Iran. And
that. No, no,
ideology is behind.
no. But that's exactly
It's the
it.
motivate. It's more. I mean, they can use it for the mobility of the people, but when it comes to their strategic plans, you are the obstacles to West.
We are, but yes, but even if it's not, even if you don't reduce it to grand strategy, the question is ultimately, if the Iranians have to make a decision, will they make a decision based on an uncompromising, unrelenting ideology, or will they make a decision based on the geostrategic reality on the ground? And I think a lot of Israelis believe that ultimately Iranians will make the radical decision regardless of reality. And I am convinced that that is not the case. I am convinced that Iranians, religiously even, are obligated to make a geostrategic decision, not a decision that is an attempt to promote an uncompromising ideology. I think that the
Do you
Iranians,
believe that? Do you believe that Iran is using Israel for internal consumption, and from the other side, is using Israel in order to come closer to Arabs? So actually, doesn't care really about Israel, but it uses Israel from time to time for its own goals.
I don't think Iran, I don't know if I would say that Iran is that calculated. Okay, I don't know if I could say that this is all part of a completely rational, detached, sort of very a coldly computed plan. I think there is also some ideology and some conviction and some general response to Israel and some fear and some anger and some hatred. I think it's all there. But I think you're right in the sense that Iran really has neither an active interest in the destruction of Israel nor a commitment to pursuing that destruction. I think Iran will go after Israel if Israel attacks it or if Israel proves too much of an interruption. But even then, Iran is not seeking to destroy Israel. I don't think that's part of the Iranian agenda. So I think you are mostly right. I don't usually think countries or political situations work that way. You know, when Iranians know very well they're using Israel to get close to the Arabs, Iran's relationship with the Arabs is cyclical. It's always been cyclical. And it'll probably stay cyclical. But I don't think Iran is after the destruction of Israel. I think that is, um, in many ways, Israeli hype, Israeli spin. And if you want to talk about domestic consumption, Iran is very useful to Israel's leadership, certainly over the last 10 or 15 years for domestic consumption. Israelis are very sensitive to the notion of an existential threat, a Nazi style potential for extinction, um, somebody who has genocidal thoughts about Jews, and the notion that such an enemy actually exists is crucially important for the Israeli leadership's ability to control the sensitivities of Israeli public opinion.
Ori, but why you compare Iran to Nazis and to someone that wants to exterminate Jews? I mean, Iranians never really were against Jewish or inside Iran or outside Iran. In the Second World War, the embassy, actually the consulate of Iran, of Iran in France saved thousands of Jewish. So why? I mean, do you take this kind of part? And we hear this from Israel that Iran, there is this kind of literal case that Iran is working like Nazis against Israel.
Oh, just to make it clear, I don't think that. Of course, I'm speaking.
Yeah, of course.
You know, as a spokesperson, you know, I'm trying to represent what the Israeli leadership says. Why does the Israeli leadership think that? Well, look, there is definitely rhetoric coming from Iran that is very intense. That talks about Israel, how Israel has no historical right to exist, about how reality will wipe Israel out. There are all sorts of things that Iranians say that are not palatable to Israeli ears. But other than that, Israelis, the Israeli public consciousness, is still almost 80 years after the end of the Second World War, very much geared towards detecting existential threats to Jews. Okay, and remember how we started our conversation when I told you that Israel's defining tension is the tension between Judaism and statehood, between Jewish and democratic. That tension is also relevant to this question, right? Because if we are also very much Jewish at heart, and our collective memory as Jews is the memory of genocide. And it's very easy to use that for political purposes. It's very easy to say, well, you know, this is the way it is, right? We're Jews. This is what the world does to Jews. So we have to be prepared. We have to invest a lot of money. We have to defend ourselves. We have to make a conscientious effort. All of that is something that comes very naturally, both to Israeli politicians and to the Israeli public.
Ori, how do the Iranian Jews that they live in Israel feel about it?
Oh, very good question. Iranian Jews who live in Israel lead fairly insulated lives. Okay, when you talk about Middle Eastern communities of Jews that came to Israel and became Israeli, Iranian Jews, while they have a large contribution to Israeli identity and to Israeliness, generally tend to keep to themselves. Right? They don't. They're less prominent in terms of their ethnicity and their culture than North African Jews, for example. And the Iranian Jews are very loyal to Israel, but they're also very Iranian in their consciousness and their sensibilities. They're very particular about preserving the language, about listening to Persian music, about eating Persian food. They're insular, but they maintain a much closer sense of cultural kinship with Iran than, for example, say, Syrian Jews with Syria or Algerian Jews with Algeria. Right? So it's complicated. It's a complicated community.
I think there is a, I don't know if it's still published. There was a kind of newspaper by a Jewish, by Iranian Jewish in Holon.
Yeah. They've got all sorts of things. I think they're now. I recently saw just a few days ago that they are creating. They're inaugurating an association for the promotion of Iranian culture. Okay, and it's exactly in Khulon, exactly in that place that you're talking about. They have a center there, and um, it's strange because I think most of the activities they have there are attended by older people, and it's considered more something that the older people do. But the younger people are actually still very much a part of this identity. They still carry it. It's a very distinct ethnic Jewish identity, even within Israeli society.
Do they feel like kind of the, I mean, for example, we have Jewish from around the world. Do you see any kind of racism as against Iranian Jewish that they live in Israel?
No. They're very much a part of society, but because culturally they keep to themselves. Okay, there's a kind of a separation. It's not racism at all. No, nobody considers them, double agents or accuses them of double loyalty. It's just that they've always kept to themselves, so they're just considered special, not anything more dramatic than that.
How does it work? This in Israel. Israel at the moment is having a kind of. Can we say that there is a kind of conflict between Iran and Israel? What's the situation at the moment between these two countries?
Sure, yeah, there's conflict. There's even, we don't you don't have Iranian.
I'm wondering because Iran doesn't recognize Israel. So, from the international law perspective, it is a conflict. From the Iranian perspective, it's not because Israel is not a country.
No, Iran doesn't recognize Israel officially, but it most definitely recognizes Israel effectively. So there's a conflict, and it's got a lot of dimensions. Some of them are pretty intense. There is an ongoing cyber war with Iranian hackers trying to disrupt Israeli cyber operations, and Israeli hackers doing the same. There is a naval war that came to light a few months ago with Israelis trying to either commandeer or sink Iranian ships on the high seas if they are carrying either oil or weapons for Hezbollah, and Iran trying to do the same to ships owned by Israeli businessmen. But there is, to some extent, a kind of a war on the high seas. There is a war going on in Syria. Israel regularly attacks Iranian installations in Syria or Iranian convoys bringing in parts or weapons or whatever. So the conflict is ongoing. Israel has had strikes in Iraq. Israel has performed all sorts of actions within Iran itself, including assassinations. Israel has assassinated nuclear scientists and a general who was in charge of military nuclear research. So this is happening right now. It's not a potential thing. It's happening right now.
But how does Israel see the strategy of Hezbollah after the assassination of Soleimani?
Well, Hezbollah is a problem for Israel, not just because it has a
What
lot
kind
of.
of what kind of problem do you believe that, I mean, Hezbollah is something strong that can effectively cause operational problems to Israel, can threat the security of Israel?
Good question. According to numbers published by officially, revealed by Israeli Defense Establishment spokespersons, Hezbollah has anywhere from 130,000 to 150,000 rockets. Some of them are quite accurate. Hezbollah intends to use these rockets mostly against Israel.
Where
Now,
are these where are these rockets? Are
all
they
over, including in villages, in residential homes. Hezbollah has these rockets all over Lebanon. That's a threat. Hezbollah most likely could not um, destroy Israel. I don't think it wants to destroy Israel, but if there was a war and Hezbollah concentrated its intelligence and its rocket capabilities on the Israeli hinterland, on the Israeli heartland, then Hezbollah could make life pretty miserable for Israelis for at least a week or two. Okay? Casualties from rocket fire would probably not be extremely dramatic, but people would die. And roads would be closed, and government installations would be hit, and power stations would be shut down. And if you integrate that with a cyber attack that say shuts down banks or shuts down hospital computers, life could get pretty hectic in Israel. Hezbollah is a real enemy. But the problem that Hezbollah presents for Israel is not just a military one. The problem is that Hezbollah is perhaps the most powerful political player in Lebanon. You cannot conceive of a future for Lebanon without the participation of Hezbollah.
How
Yet,
does Israel see that?
Israel knows this, but it tries to resist it. It tries to insist that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization.
By law, it's in the parliament. By law, it
Uh,
has an army.
yeah, well, that's Lebanon for you. Lebanon is always complicated, right? Excessively. So Israel tries to insist that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and is therefore not a potential partner for any kind of real negotiation. But Israel is very much alone in that position. Okay, even though Hezbollah is still branded a terrorist organization by the EU and by the United States, I think it's becoming very clear to just about everyone that there is no future for Lebanon if Hezbollah is not part of the negotiations. So Israel is trying very hard to explain why this is not acceptable. Um,
I think that this occurred after the war in 2006, and especially after the last visit of Macron in
mhm.
Lebanon. It was the first time that he wanted, and actually twice or three times, official bodies of French government they met with Hezbollah,
Mhm.
discussing about Lebanon and the funding of Lebanon and everything. And Hezbollah had its own plan about MIF and how these investments will happen. So
Yeah.
we see that Hezbollah is not only the military part, but also in the economic part, in the political part.
Oh, sure, sure, sure.
So we discuss it may be defined by Israel and some other parties as a terrorist organization, but it works as a normal organization, not a normal, as a bureaucratic organization that any other party in any other country can have. So, what is the plan of Israel when we see that Hezbollah stays in Lebanon? Personally, I see that Hezbollah is going to be empowered in Lebanon. It's not going to happen something against Hezbollah, at least in the near future. Assad is still there.
Mhm.
So after so many years of war, he remains there. Iran more or less governs Iraq,
Mhm.
despite the opposition. So we discuss about we also have the agreement with China. The 25-year agreement is 440 billions. So we discuss that a commercial and political road from Shanghai is going to end up in Beirut. Um, Iran is covering and is controlling an area from more or less from Kabul to Beirut. And this is far away from the natural borders of Iran. We discuss about the borders of interest and security of Iran. Where do the borders of security and interest of Israel end in Middle East?
Oh, that's a very contested question, very political question too. It's not something that you can necessarily answer or address based on well accepted strategic principles or formulations. It's a political question. And again, remember that when you're talking about Israel's borders of influence in the Middle East, you're talking about a country that has not yet defined its own domestic borders.
Very
Okay,
true.
so
Very true.
so yeah, we still haven't done that. How do you expect Israeli politicians to think about influence in the Middle East? And again, another difference is that Iran has many partners and allies on the ground, while Israel has mostly enemies. And it's very, very difficult for Israel to uh, strike up cooperation with independent players in the Middle East, regardless of where they are, everything Israel does has to be covert. For example, take our burgeoning friendship with Saudi Arabia. While we have an embassy in the United Arab Emirates, we don't have an embassy in Saudi Arabia yet. But we're very good friends with the Saudis. We cooperate with them on all sorts of intelligence matters. According to foreign sources, Israel has also assisted the Saudis in their war in Yemen, particularly against Shia forces there. So, we do a lot.
Actually, I had a discussion recently for some business in Saudi Arabia,
Hmm.
and in a very dramatic way, I found out that the person I was talking to, it was an Israeli with a Jordan passport.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we see that there are this kind of collaborations still there.
Yep, yep. There's a very much so. But it in response to your question, the thing is that Israel's influence, as far as I can see, and certainly in the foreseeable future, can only be covert. Iranian influence is not covert at all. Iran is there. Iran is there, and it assists populations in the field. Iranians build roads. Iranians do engineering projects. Iranians give money. Iranians bring oil. Israel can't do any of that. I don't know if it even wants to, but even if it did want to, it could not actively, openly engage in that sort of behavior. So
Why?
Israel, because nobody wants to be friends with us.
There are the Abraham Accords, so you created a kind of security
Mm.
from Persian Gulf to Gibraltar.
There's cooperation, potential cooperation, but it's a very far cry from developing active Israeli presence, in these places. I mean, the United Arab Emirates does not want active Israeli presence in, say, its military bases in Yemen. The other countries that are part of the Abraham Accords, again, they're very happy to sign all sorts of civil and economic ventures with Israel, but there's a long, long way before Israel has active security cooperation with these countries. Even, I mean, if you want to compare, Israel has a very, very intense security relationship with Azerbaijan. Right? Israel has apparently, so again, foreign sources claim that Israel has intelligence bases on the ground in Azerbaijan, that Israel sells a lot of weapons and military equipment to the Azeris, and that there is tremendous intelligence cooperation. What Israel has with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain, and those are the two main countries of the Abraham Accords, is very, very far from that. So theoretically, yes. Effectively, really no. Israel doesn't have any sort of umbrella. Maybe if Israel strikes up a public relationship with Saudi Arabia, perhaps. I don't see that happening anytime soon. That was
So
a
do you think
Trump
that
administration interest.
so do you feel yourselves a kind of loneliness
Oh
in
yeah.
the political way living in
Hmm.
Israel?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, we're also responsible for that. We go to very significant efforts to remain alone. We don't actually like having friends. Why? I'll be
This
kind
is
of
this is part of the religious exceptionalism.
uh, no, I don't think it's a religious exceptionalism. I think it's more of a cultural. Um, I think it's more condescension. Okay, we don't really think of ourselves as Middle Eastern. It is
It's
beneath
true.
us.
This is very true. This is very true.
It is beneath us to have close cooperation with Middle Eastern countries and Middle Eastern leaderships, and that's not where we see our. That's not the stadium in which we see ourselves competing. So what we have always wanted to do.
Ori, of course, you
Yeah.
don't see yourselves as part of Middle East, and you are, and if we take it from the other part, most of the Jews they came from Eastern countries. I mean, like Russia and everything, or from Central Europe,
The
or
the
from somewhere.
founding the founding fathers came from there. Okay? The founding fathers came from there, but certainly at least half of Israel's current population comes from Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries, North African countries.
So from this part, my experience being in Israel and collaborating with Israelis is that I find them extremely isolated, which means that there are people that they are doing business, they are doing networks and everything, but from the other side, they never get really exposed into relations with other people.
Oh,
Let's
sure.
say they stay in the same corner. So it was for me fabulous when I was trying to explain, for example, to a colleague how to open and monitor a bank account. He was almost afraid to get up the phone and call to the bank in UK
Hmm.
and discuss about the account. He was saying to me, please, can you help me with that? Can you ask someone from your department to do that? He was afraid to pick up the phone and speak to someone in London, but he was not afraid to speak to an Israeli interest bank in London. And for
Hmm.
me, it was very, very strange. This when I used to encourage him, just pick up the phone, talk with the person. So also when we used to hang around, we used to see that the Jewish, they go with the Jewish, the Israelis, they go with the Israelis, and they are, a little bit more afraid, to come closer with other people or to be open with other people. Of course, I don't complain because there were many people that I saw in Israel and in many collaborations that we hung around, and they were very open. They explained a lot of things and about Israel and Jewish culture. This is not what we see from the part of Iran. Iranians apparently are very open,
Hmm.
and from the other side, of course, they have their own traditional way, but they remain open. They are much more open, though they are Middle East people. They call themselves Aryans, whatever, but this is where they belong. They come from Iran, but they are much more open than the Israelis. That the Israelis are this first or second generation from people that they came from Europe, some of them.
I completely agree. I think
What is behind all? It's a kind of fear. It's a kind of mentality.
it's a mentality. Look, you can see it from. I mean, you can get a good example of it from the way Israel and Iran operate in the Middle East in terms of general policy. It's exactly as you described it. Look at Israeli policy. Israeli policy is to raise very high walls, separate itself from what is happening, and when it acts as Israelis like to call it surgically.
Yes,
Airstrikes in
true.
Syria,
Yes, very true.
um, secret raids on Iranian installations, whatever. But we send out a force and then we bring it back. We don't want any sort of dialogue. Okay, our position is we don't want. I like to think of it. One of our former prime ministers, Ehud Barak, called Israel a villa in the jungle.
Yes.
So what do you do if what do you do if you're a villa in the jungle? You build very very high walls to keep the jungle from coming in. Right? And if the jungle is threatening, if there is some sort of wild animal or some huge tree whose roots are trying to get into your villa, what you do is you deal with the problem very specifically. But you don't want to engage the jungle in any kind of dialogue. You want the walls to be as high as possible, and you want the surgical means to be as available as possible. Iran does it exactly the opposite way. The Iranian position is that if Iran willingly isolates itself, then all of Iran's enemies will come together and go after Iran collectively. So, what the Iranians do, and I think they do it from a defensive mindset, they try to um, be everywhere they can be. They try to be
True, very
influential
true, very true.
wherever they can be influential. They want to talk to everybody. Okay, they're not afraid of anybody and they don't rule anybody out. It's not because they're such peace-loving liberals. It's because that is their conscious strategic choice. And they make that choice because they feel that that is their best chance of survival. Israel is exactly the other way around. Israel trusts
Keep,
only
keep,
itself.
keep, keep in mind, if someone knows the Persians best, it's the Greeks. During the the Greco-Persian wars,
Hmm.
there were some very fabulous politicians, including Themistocles, that he fought against them in the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. And after
Hmm.
all, he fled for help to Persia. He became one of the commissionaries in one of the provinces of Persian Empire.
Hmm.
So we know how the Persians work, and we know where their politics get into. But you are very right about it. What we discuss about Iran is that we say that Iran is powerful in the operational way, the military way,
Hmm.
and but it's not so successful in the intelligence way as Israel is. I think that Israel is much more successful in the intelligence services because it has probably the help of United States or other organizations and countries, but Iran remains very isolated in the
No, but
intelligence.
Israel is exactly as you're saying. Israel is very tactical. Israel
Yes.
operates very effectively at a tactical level. The Iranians appreciate the tactical level, but it's not the level that concerns them. They are either operational. Soleimani, that we talked about before, he was a gifted operational player. He understood the system at the middle of it. Or they're strategic. You know, they strive for long-term influence, and long-term influence, as far as they are concerned, can only come from dialogue and interaction, not from isolation. The Israeli policy may be effective in the short term, but in the mid and long term, I don't think it'll be very effective at all.
What do you expect to happen in the next 2 3 years that now we discuss? We have the negotiations in Vienna. How do you see Iranians acting on this matter, and what Israel is expecting from these
I think
negotiations?
it's a good question. I think the Iranians have very little faith in the United States, even in Biden. I think they don't trust the United States. And I think they want to be reassured in a significant way that the United States is capable of allowing Iran the opportunities that it has missed because of Trump's policies. And I think the Iranians are going to make the Americans work very hard for a return to negotiations. I think they will be long and arduous. I don't know if there will necessarily be a new deal at the end, but I think Iran has a real interest in pursuing the diplomatic path still. I think the political decision that Iran made in 2014, 2015 to sign the JCPOA still holds, even though there's a conservative regime in Tehran, and even though there's a change in policy. I think Iran is still. I think Khamenei is still committed to this agreement and to the potential for cooperation. Something very drastic will have to happen for this to change. I think again the Iranians are going to make the Americans work hard for this agreement, but ultimately I think there will be an agreement. What is Israel doing? Israel has put itself up against the wall. Israel has isolated itself. Israel has defined its situation as successful if the Iranians are curtailed, if they are stopped, and as a failure if Iran is able to pursue its own agenda. I think, as far as the United States and Europe are concerned, it's very important to let the Iranians feel that they are pursuing their own agenda. So I think everybody is now aligned around an interest that is pretty much contrary to Israel's interest. So Israel is putting on a very brave, tough face. We're responsible for our own destiny. We're taking charge. But ultimately, Israel will have to fall in line. I don't think Israel has any other option.
Why this change happen now, or why Netanyahu is living in Naftali Bennett's came, and actually we had Ram for first time in the government. Are United States getting tired by Israel, by funding Israel? They want Israel to find a
Uh,
way to coexist with Arabs.
First of all, yes, I think the Israeli public is tired. A lot of it is domestic. I think Netanyahu really, pretty much like Trump, you know, he has his base. They're very fervent. They're very devoted, but ultimately they don't represent the general Israeli public. General Israeli public is not necessarily opposed to Netanyahu's ideas, but he was very much opposed to Netanyahu's way of acting, to his demeanor, to his behavior. So that was the reason for change in Israel now. Bennett is trying to play very tough. Bennett thinks that politically it would be beneficial for him to be as tough as Netanyahu, at least in terms of public posture. But Bennett also wants the cooperation of the world. Bennett understands that Netanyahu did Israel real significant damage in terms of its international standing. Okay, world leaders, except for people like Bolsonaro in Brazil and Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey, Except for that group, world leaders began to draw away from Israel, began to, be less committed to Israel's security and safety because of Netanyahu. Bennett understands that. Bennett wants to reforge Israel's international ties. So Bennett is going to need to play a complicated game. He's going to need to talk tough for the consumption of the Israeli public, but he's going to need to discreetly agree to whatever the international community tells him he needs to agree to.
How tough is for Ram to be this period in a coalition government?
Oh no, I don't think it's that tough for them at all. I think that for the first time there is an expression of a political division within the Israeli-Palestinian public. Okay, it doesn't see itself as fully committed to the left. Ram is a conservative religious party. It's got a right-wing economic agenda. They're going for the money. They're going for the budgets. I don't think it's tough for them at all. Actually, I think it's a very natural partnership. Once you transcend the ethnic division line, once it's no longer about Arabs and Jews, but it's about right and left, economically, socially, politically, the cooperation is an obvious one.
Already before you said that there is an obvious hate from the part of Iran towards Israel. How do you interpret this hate? Why do you believe that there is this kind of? I don't believe that people they hate Israelis or Jewish. I mean, how do you interpret this kind of hate?
Most of it, I think, is explainable politically and historically. Israel is the one of the most obvious and blatant expressions of Western imperialism. Okay, if I try to speak like an Iranian leader, and the Islamic regime was formed on an anti-imperialist platform. There were also others, but this was its foreign policy platform to fight imperialism, to fight for the oppressed of the earth. So there was hatred there. There's hatred because, like I said, Israel was very, very good friends with the Shah, and the Islamic regime wanted to do the opposite of what the Shah did. And there's also hatred because Israel and Iran have a very, very turbulent, intense relationship. In Israel, it's very clear to most Israelis that Iran is the aggressor and Israel is defending itself. But the truth is, both countries are full of very violent, very hostile rhetoric towards each other. Both countries are not each other's immediate priority. That's also important. It's easy to use them for domestic consumption because you don't have to start a war with them if you trash talk.
What is the first priority for Iran now?
First priority for Iran now, economic mostly. Okay, not geostrategic or
On the foreign policy, what is the priority for Iran? What does Iran wants to construct?
Iran. First of all, again, Iran wants to lift sanctions. Okay, and Iran wants influence. What it has always wanted, it wants deterrence against radical Sunnism and against the Sunni countries that might consider um, fighting its influence. It wants influence in the Gulf and in the surrounding countries. It wants influence in Afghanistan. It wants influence in Iraq. Okay, and it wants influence in Syria because it's also important to Iranian interests. It wants to reach some sort of modus vivendi with Israel, I think, some kind of stability there. But more than anything, it wants a place at the big boys' table. It wants to be accepted into the family of, at the very least, regional powers. Right? It wants the respect that it feels it deserves, and it wants the opportunities it feels it has been denied because of Trump and Israel. That's the most important thing Iran wants.
Already, since 2016, there is no Saudi embassy in Iran due to the demonstrations against the embassy and the size of the embassy. Bin Salman, I believe that he's a very progressive leader. He's doing some good things, and generally, he's taking Saudi Arabia really high. I mean, when I see from the investment perspective, at least he's doing a very good job. So recently, he sent a kind of mission to Iraq, where they met with Zarif before the elections. It was, I think, it was the Minister of Tourism met with the Syrian Minister of Tourism as well. So we see that Saudi Arabia, after the accusations of Biden against Mohammed bin Salman, is trying to reach the axis of resistance. How does this affect the Israeli foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia?
Oh, I really think that the situation is more complex than that. First of all, I'm not a big fan of Ben Salman. Um, I think that Ben Salman is a reformer in name only. I think he's a corrupt man. I think he's a brutal man. I think the violence that that he uses against his domestic enemies and against civilians in Yemen is really, as bad as it can get. Um, but I also think that the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia are, how should I phrase this? I think the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia are indispensable, and it is inevitable that they will become much better than they have been. It's a cycle. I think both sides know that. And I think the Saudis are actually a little more comfortable with the new regime in Tehran because it's more conservative and it doesn't serve as a direct threat to Saudi influence. The new regime, being more conservative, wants to maintain some sort of borders between itself and the world. It doesn't seek to engage the West. It doesn't directly compete with Saudi for influence in the Gulf in the eyes of the West and the international community. And right now, we are receiving reports of the relationship growing strong again, of consultations. There are mutual greetings. The foreign ministers are meeting. So I actually think that the Iranian-Saudi relationship will improve significantly before it deteriorates into anything that resembles conflict.
Ori, it's our last question, and it came actually from a very good friend of the show. Is asking, how do you see Iran going further in Middle East in the next years under Raisi?
Well, I actually don't. I mean, not that I think Iran will remove all of its troops, but I think I'm going to be a little speculative here. I think something interesting is going to happen. I think Iran is not going to publicly accept any kind of international reprimand or rebuke for its regional activities, but I think you're going to see the leadership in Tehran curtail these activities, limit them, reduce them to some extent. Why? Because I actually think Raisi and the conservatives understand that they have a significant problem. The Iranian public does not really support them. And those who do expect them not to go about trying to either defeat the world or join the world, but to fix things in Iran. That is their main challenge. If they want the Islamic Republic to survive, they have to fix things in Iran. One of the symbolic gestures they can make to show that they are fixing things in Iran is to restrain their activity outside Iran. So I think it would be beneficial for them politically to do so. And I think that it will also have an added effect of proving to the world that Iran is a serious partner for business, even if it is conservative and religious and hardline.
But only we see a country that I think is something like 200 million people that they celebrate Nowruz every
Mm-hmm.
year. It's
Mm-hmm.
something like 4 or 5 countries that they speak Farsi or a dialect of
Mm-hmm.
Farsi. So by nature, Iranians they go out of the borders. I think that the Iranian
Of course they
influence.
do. Yeah, I
So
agree.
how can Raisi keep
Oh,
Iranian
let's
exposure?
no, no, but you have to differentiate between Iran's cultural space and Iran's effective political influence space, if you want to call it that. Iran certainly plays a part in places like Tajikistan and Afghanistan, places like that. and Iran will continue to play a part there. Iran will continue to defend the Shia. Iran will continue to be involved in Lebanon. It will continue to be involved in Yemen. But I think what the next year or two will bring is an Iran that is less eager to be in everybody's face, that is less confrontative. Okay, even though this is a traditional Iran and a conservative regime. I think that this course for the future, an Iran that reduces, an Islamic regime that reduces its external involvement gradually, slowly, discreetly, and focuses most of its efforts on maintaining its hold on Iran domestically and on improving relations with the citizens. This is a crucial fact that most people who don't know Iran miss easily. Even though Iran is a dictatorship, the Iranian tradition of popular revolt is a unique one. You know, when Egyptians revolted 10 years ago, almost 11, against Mubarak, nobody could have imagined that they could do that. But over the last 120 years, Iranians took to the streets 4 times in popular revolt against their rulers. The 1979 revolution was the fourth such revolt in less than a century. And
Yeah.
this is something that every Iranian leader knows. You don't have to have a democracy to understand that you need to listen to the Iranian public. You need to be able to address their grievances. And right now, the Islamic regime is in trouble. The conservatives are in trouble. They know that.
Do you believe that the Islamic Republic will not survive?
No, I actually think it will. I don't see any real opposition to the Islamic Republic anytime in the future. But in order to survive effectively, and these people are smart, they need to forge a link with their citizens. Okay? Not to become a democracy or anything, but to address the grievances of the citizens. I think Raisi is very much on board with that. I think he understands that. I think Khamenei understands that. It remains to be seen who will succeed Khamenei. And also, we need to remember that the Iranian leadership, despite its pragmatism, is also corrupt and cliquey and also.
But or of course, Iranians they come and they say it's none of your business what we do in Iran. We know our people better. We don't expect someone from United States, Israel, Europe to come and say to us that we are corrupted or we don't do things as we should to be. We are a very traditional country. We are a very traditional economy. We know what's going on. So they come, they say what you, this kind of, they don't accept, let's say, this kind of lecturing about democracy and politics. And don't forget that democracy has very specific definitions. For example, it was democracy in Athens. It was also democracy in a way in Sparta. So democracy is something that we see in Greece, but also something we see in Iran or in Russia or the United States. So how can we come and say that Iran is, it's a kind of dictatorship, and Iran doesn't, the leadership doesn't, I mean, pay attention to the people?
Look, it's complicated. The leadership does not pay attention to the people directly, but I mean, because it's not a democracy. But the leadership and the Iranian authoritarian state is very much in what's the word I'm looking for? Embedded in Iranian society. It's not detached. A good dictatorship is always embedded in its society. It always knows how that society works. And the Iranian leadership knows what its citizens want. And the grievances of the rest of the world about democracy, they're hypocritical. Remember that the world has kept up Arab dictatorships for decades and decades and is still doing so, even after the world seemingly supported
I'm making, just to clarify myself, I'm making this kind of question because if you come here in Cyprus and you say about Israel, Cyprus, they say Israel is a dictatorship. I mean, those people, they kill Palestinians or Jewish in the street. And when you say, when the Cypriot students, they go to study mostly medicine in Israel, they come back, they say we cannot live there. It's a concentration camp. So that's why I try to understand why it's supposed to, we declare what if it's saying that Iran is an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship. How does this help for example, the
Oh,
Israeli foreign policy to understand Iran?
it doesn't help at all. It's just it's an Israeli vanity. It doesn't help at all. At least in my opinion, I think it's stupid. I think when you have Israel's prime minister talk about how Iran's president used to be a hangman and how he eats cream cakes while his people suffer, I think that's very stupid, very outdated, very harmful to Israeli interests. But Israel is in love with its anti Iranian rhetoric. And Israel loves to look good, loves to have an enemy that makes it look good, at least in its own eyes. It's meant mostly for domestic consumption in Israel, and even here, people don't buy that. It's very clear to people that Sisi in Egypt is as vicious a dictator as Khamenei is in Iran, and we're best friends with Sisi. And the same goes for Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
Do you feel secure where you go to Egypt as an Israeli Jewish?
I haven't actually been to Egypt, but I think I would feel secure there. Yeah. I mean, I don't. I think I don't know if I would stand out. I know that there are quite a few people who go there. Um, I think, yeah. I don't think Israeli Jews need to feel insecure. But the minute they land in Egypt, they have official police escorts, and so they're watched always. So no, I don't think it helps in any way for Israel to behave as it behaves. I think it's mostly Israeli vanity and Israeli reflex, if you will.
How do they see these ideas in the official bodies in Israel where you come out and you say these things?
Um, I told you, I'm generally considered crazy, but not really crazy. I mean, people say, okay, well, this is you're a leftist. This is your left wing agenda. This is why you're talking. Or some other people will tell me that I am an academic. I'm a theoretician. I deal with ideas. I don't understand reality on the ground. I actually think I'm a very practical person. I think most of what I'm saying is being justified by reality. And I think I have a lot of colleagues all over the world who agree with me. Israel and the Israelis are very stubborn. And like you said very accurately previously, Israelis tend to trust mostly themselves. They understand themselves to be alone, they're isolated, they don't talk to a lot of people, they feel like the world doesn't have Israel's best interests at heart. Um, but I don't
Of
think
course,
this will.
of course, this is very true. I mean, outside your yard, you don't really care. You care about your yard. This is
Yeah,
it's more or less, yes. It's of course.
that's
I
a
mean,
very it's a very Israeli approach. It's
I
a
think
very
that
Israeli approach.
this is the truth. Or it's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, and
Um,
my pleasure as well.
we hear a lot of interesting things, and actually, I learned a lot, and I'm sure from the messages that the emails I received from the people that this has happened as well. So a lot of the questions they came from the public.
Wonderful.
Um, we are going to be together hopefully in 2022. We tried to do a kind of more expand panel about Israel and Iran. So probably we're going to have some people also from Israel. I don't know if we're going to have someone from Iran, but certainly we're going to have someone from Europe and United States that they
Very good.
discuss about these things. You are one of our precious guests, and we're very happy that you are here with us. Of course, you are more than welcome to Cyprus. We are expecting for you. So anytime you can contact us and the production. We're very glad that the people that participated in the Tonight Show, well, thank you very much for watching us on Sunday. We're going to be with you once again on the 7th of November that we're going to discuss about Iran once again with our guest. We wish everybody to stay home and be secure, take care of themselves. And you can watch our shows on our channel on YouTube and in our channel as well on internet. Thank you very much, Ori. It's a pleasure to host you.
It was my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for everything, giving us and sharing with us tonight. And we're going to see each other soon on the 7th of November. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. Good night, Ori.
Good night.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.